Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 32 of Superannuated Starman. I'm Sean Ryan, and I'm joined by Chris Duerksen and Cory Braucks.
Howdy.
So we're not recording at our normal time because we have a special guest who I'm going to introduce in a second. But today we're going to be covering a game that has spawned a franchise and created one of the most iconic female video game protagonists of the day. Here with us today to discuss the original Tomb Raider, coming all the way from England, is Devin. Devin, thank you so much for joining us. We're extremely happy to hear you and hear your thoughts on the game. How are you doing today? And if you would, tell us in the audience a little bit about yourself.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me. So my name is Devin. I am from England, born and raised, and I actually have been playing video games since I was a very, very little kid, starting off right at the start with Tomb Raider. So I'm really excited to be talking about that today. I've been really into video games pretty much my whole life, and I now actually teach video game and game design at a university level. So I'm keeping it in the interest area.
What? Dude, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I'm learning that for the first time too. That is amazing.
My jaw is dropping. Like that makes you instantly one of the coolest.
I brought that up.
No, you did not.
I'm almost certain I did.
You're almost certain, and I'm certain you did not.
I'll go look through the logs. Don't make me fight you.
Please do.
All right. Well, while you're looking through the logs, what we're going to do is that we're going to be taking a short break. But first, I want to talk about the original game was released in 1996, and the third entry in the series, Tomb Raider 3 Adventures of Lara Croft, was released in 1998. We didn't want to start with the third game, and our guest really wanted to talk Tomb Raider, so I figure this is close enough. So before we dive into the history of the game, enjoy this music, and when we return, we will discuss the history of Tomb Raider. Developed by Core Design, a British video game developer based out of Derby, England, and published by Eidos or Eidos Interactive. During the break, we all had a small discussion about how to pronounce this. So if I'm wrong, please correct me in the comments, join our Discord, let me know.
We don't care.
So Eidos Interactive, the action-adventure game, follows the adventure of the archaeologist Lara Croft. Tomb Raider first released on the Sega Saturn in Europe in October of 1996, and it wasn't until the following month that the game landed on MS-DOS and PlayStation in both North America and Europe, as well as finally releasing on the Sega Saturn in North America. The initial concept was created by Toby Gard, who is regarded as the creator of Lara Croft and who served as the lead artist for the game, drawing influence for the character from several sources such as the British comic Tank Girl, Indiana Jones, and the Hong Kong action film Hard Boiled. During a brainstorming session with Core Design's company, Jeremy Heathsmith, Gard proposed the concept of Tomb Raider for the then unreleased PlayStation. Given permission to begin work on the project, he and programmer Paul Douglas worked on pre-production for 6 months before the two-man team expanded to a total of 6 people. With a budget of approximately £440,000, development lasted for 18 months, beginning in 1994. Development was not without some hiccups, though. Core Design was sold to Centergold, who was then in turn purchased by Eidos Interactive in May of 1996, who would eventually publish the game. The main protagonist was originally a male character resembling Indiana Jones. However, Gard had originally envisioned giving the player a choice to choose between a male or female protagonist. After realizing that two characters meant double the work, The choice was made to pare it down to one. The female character, originally named Laura Cruz, was his favorite of the two, and so he discarded the male. This choice was met with objections from Eidos executives who had disagreed with the choice to rename the character to Laura Croft. But Guard insisted that his choice was right for one and that he wanted to provide an action icon for the younger generation. The title was developed for the Sega Saturn, MS-DOS, and Sony PlayStation simultaneously. After sending out early builds to both Sony Europe and Sony America, Sony Europe approved the game early on. However, Sony America rejected the game's concept and asked for more and better content. In response, the team made several changes to the game's design and provided a version that led to worldwide Sony approval. In the last few months of development, Sega negotiated a timed exclusivity deal with Core Design, forcing the team to crunch, ultimately releasing the Saturn version 6 weeks earlier than planned to the European audience. Following the Saturn's release, several bugs were found that affected all versions of the game. However, with the exclusivity deal in place, Core Design had the time to fix these bugs on the PlayStation and MS-DOS before their worldwide release. In 1997, negotiations began to bring Laura to the Nintendo 64 with plans to redesign some of the game's mechanics to better incorporate the analog stick. However, the team never received development kits for the N64, and the port was scrapped after Sony finalized a deal to keep subsequent titles exclusive to the Sony PlayStation until the year 2000. Development of this game is fortunately well documented, and there are a lot of resources available online if you'd like to know more about the development history. I'm not going to go on too much longer, but I'm going to bring up some things that have surrounded Tomb Raider since its inception. The first is obviously Laura's physique. It's well known that Laura Croft is particularly busty, and this occurred when Guard was messing around with the character model and accidentally increased the size of her breasts by 150%.
Accidentally.
After correcting his mistake, other developers had seen what he had done, said they liked it, and said it should be kept in. So in an all-male staff, history was made. And in a similar vein, with any franchise, there's typically a group that just can't let us have nice things. A fan-made mod was created for the PC version of the game that removed Laura's clothing and was dubbed Nude Raider. After cease and desist letters and some legal action to enforce the company's copyright, Eidos Interactive was awarded the Nude Raider domain, and rumors began that a cheat code had already existed in the game that removed her clothing, and management actually suggested that such a feature be added, but Core Design refused. In response, they added a secret code in the sequel that was very similar to the alleged nudity code that would, instead of removing her clothing, it would blow Laura up. Advertising for the third game in the series would lean into the controversy even further with a quote saying, "We improved everything you asked for, but sorry, still no nude code." All of this is just crazy to me that you have this diehard group that just insists on something problematic like that. I just don't get it. What are your takes on it?
I remember everybody, like when I was a kid, everybody thought there's the nude code in there. And I don't know, it was like some secret that everybody was still trying to figure out. I mean, this was before the internet, or it was when the internet was still fairly fresh in most homes.
In its infancy, for sure.
Yeah. And everybody was trying to figure out the nude code. And of course, I knew several people that played this game. And yeah, everybody insisted that it was in there, but they'd never seen it.
And we'll talk a little bit more about that in our childhood memories, because I think we all have something similar. But I really kind of wanted to get your opinions on the entirety of this, like her physique being changed and people insisting on, you have management insisting on the nude code. I just don't understand this.
Can't just, I mean, like, it's just gross. I mean, just describing that, I can just picture the smell in that room of all these horny dudes trying to insist on putting this.
Executives.
Oh, yeah.
I definitely think the industry has changed for the good since those times.
Yes, absolutely. And with more female developers and gamers and just females getting into that industry and being a part of these teams, I think that they kind of would have been a lot more of the steady hand to ensure that there wasn't so much even controversy around it by just saying, no, we're not doing it. because it's just absolutely uncalled for. There's no need for it.
I mean,
You don't-
good on them for saying like, "Hey, don't be a creep."
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, could you imagine?
Definitely
it-
can notice the change as the new versions of Tomb Raider have been released over the years, that each time her chest size has decreased.
Yeah.
That's a really good
I-
point
I-
that I hadn't
I-
even thought about.
And
And
gotten less cartoony and less, just gross. Like,
and that's something to think about when we talk about like the reboot of the series. If they had kept her proportions as they were with the Sony PlayStation originals, it would have just been completely cartoonish. And with graphics getting closer and closer to realism, that would have been very gross, like you said, Chris, but also just immersion breaking. Like that's not something
That
I
would-
want to see.
that would have been the focus of everything. That would have just been a complete distraction.
Exactly. That would have been its own new controversy for another decade. But with all that out of the way, let's take another music break unless someone has something they want to add. And with no objections, enjoy this music from Tomb Raider. Welcome back, everyone. This is a segment where we're going to talk about our childhood memories of Tomb Raider. Devin, as our guest, we'd like you to start us off with your childhood memories of this game. Did you own or rent this, or maybe was it something a friend owned and you had played at their house? I'd like to hear your entire story about this game and everything surrounding it.
Sure. I mean, we might be here forever if I go through the entire story. But so actually, it was my dad that got me into video games when I was young. I used to joke that he obviously wanted a son rather than a daughter, and he decided to get me to play video games anyway. And that's just a bit silly, really, because it's absolutely a hobby that's for everyone, not specifically just for guys or just for girls or anything like that. Anyone can play, and I loved it. In fact, I was more into the video games than he was. I think he bought Tomb Raider initially for him to play himself. I tried it one day and I played it way more than he did. And it wasn't necessarily the ideal setup to play Tomb Raider. It was on PC, and the controller that he had on PC was actually a flight stick style controller. So I don't know if you played with normal controllers, but playing it with a flight stick when it's difficult enough with a normal controller, let me tell you, it was difficult. I must have replayed levels so many times trying to get the control system work. Because to be honest, the control system was already pretty janky as it was at times, especially with camera angles and limitations like that. But yeah, playing with a flight stick, that was an interesting experience.
That is insane to me. But what other games or systems did you have at that time that you were into? Was it just these third-person action adventure games that you really were drawn to, or what other games did you enjoy?
Well, that's about the earliest games that I can remember. The earliest console I had was the Mega Drive. And then the earliest handheld I had was the Game Gear. And on those, I play things like Sonic, Micro Machines. I play fighting games. I really just had a voracious appetite for all things video games. So any genre I would be trying out. Those genres I've really narrowed down these days, and I started to lean much more towards role-playing games, all sorts of RPGs, especially JRPGs, RPGs even. And that actually happened in a way because of Tomb Raider. Because I had such positive memories of Tomb Raider, I remember seeing in a gaming magazine a few years later this advert for a game, and it was comparing the main character to Lara Croft. And I thought I should try that game. believe it or not, this is the strangest comparison from this sense when you think about how different these games are. But this advert comparing this character to Lara Croft was for Final Fantasy X-2, which was unbelievable. But it was because it was Yuna.
It was Yuna, okay.
Yuna in short shorts with double pistols. So they said,
oh.
Yeah, that was literally the only reason for the comparison. So I went out and I actually found that game in a WH Smith for £10, ridiculously cheap. Played it and since then never looked back and always went for RPGs.
Well, happy results then, right?
Yeah, and I still play Tomb Raider games to this day, and actually over time they've become more RPG-like with the new iterations and the reboots. So it's come around full circle.
Yeah. And that was something I wanted to discuss later on when we talk about a replay and kind of talk about Tomb Raider and Laura in the modern day. But is there anything else you want to talk about with your childhood memories?
I think it's difficult to say because I was so young when I played them, first of all. But actually, I didn't have those experiences that you were mentioning earlier about naked Lara Croft and all of the controversy and people trying to find the code. Maybe because I was so young, maybe because when I was that young, I wasn't someone who had a lot of friends who played video games. So I didn't hear the video game buzz outside of what came from my dad or what came from gaming magazines that we used to get. So that's not actually something I had experience of. For me, it was all about just how cool Lara was and how cool this puzzle solving was. And for me, I didn't really think about her physique. She was just an awesome character. And she was this cool woman that it would be amazing to be like when I was older, kind of thing.
Did you ever end up watching the films later on with Angelina Jolie as the titular character?
Yeah, I've watched Angelina Jolie once, and I've watched the new reboot version of the film as well. And I have to say, I again really liked it when I was younger. When I got a bit older, I liked the Angelina Jolie films less because it came across more sexualized than how it felt to me when I was young watching them. And you know, public opinions of Angelina Jolie herself have changed. That also then kind of reflects differently on the films themselves, doesn't it?
That's kind of an interesting point that not only have the games and films evolved into the more mature Laura, that's just something that you don't see often. Typically, they will kind of lean into what they feel is going to give them better sales, and that is hypersexualization a lot of times.
It's interesting you say about mature as well, actually, because I was thinking about this when I was playing the games, and I thought, Lara is older in the original games. I'm sure she is. I didn't know what her actual age was, so I took a look. And in the first game, she was 29, which then meant she went from late 20s to early 30s by Tomb Raider 3. And in the reboots, she starts off at 21. They made her younger. So in one way, she's actually much less mature, but it also allowed her to have depth of character, and they were able to explore development of character through that much more. So on one hand, it's kind of a shame that they went then from someone who's established to young and perky teenage almost, but actually allowed for more character growth. So it's interesting about the word mature and actually how that relates in terms of how her age actually decreased as the games went on in terms of the reboots.
As far as like the over sexualization of everything, this game pretty much started off as a 10, so the only way they could take it was down. So
that's a really good point, and I don't want to jump ahead into my replay because I didn't really have any experiences of this, so I'm going to kind of tie this in later on. But I'm going to talk about my memories very quick, which are very, very quick, because I had never played this game when I was younger outside of those demo discs that you get in like PlayStation Magazine and everything. But I knew who Lara Croft was because the market saturation was massive. There were large cardboard displays promoting the game, promoting Lara Croft. She was on the cover of several video game magazines of that time. And of course, like we discussed in the history, there was the nude code that was talked about almost endlessly at school. For at least Chris and I, in 1996, we were in 6th grade. So you have middle school boys and girls. And when you have middle school boys, they're going to be talking about very specific topics. And when you add video games and girls, that was going to be one of them.
I'm curious, actually. When I was doing a little bit of digging, when I went back for the replay, I saw about how they initially actually hired models to play Lara. And in a way, they still do these kinds of things today. When you go to conventions, they might have people dressed up. They also have, like you said, the actors representing the character in films. But I was wondering, were you exposed when you were younger to any of those real life models who were Lara Croft?
No,
No,
personally,
not at all.
I didn't. Yeah, we were in a small town, and there was nothing like that in our area. And even when I moved up to where I am now, much bigger school and everything, I wasn't going to video game conventions or anything like that.
Well, Chris, why don't you just roll into your memories of this game if you have any?
All right, yeah. Just to build off what she was saying about how her childhood memories seemed a lot more pure than mine of it. Keep in mind, like Sean said, this came out when we were in junior high. By the time PlayStations were more common, that was high school for me, and I didn't even get a PlayStation or have any experience with PlayStation up until like my, I want to say like junior year. And everybody that I knew that had any experience with this game, like we were 16-year-old dudes, and her physique was pretty much the main focus. Even in stores, magazines, stores, everything, like it was pushing the gameplay aspect of it a little bit, like the exploration and everything. I mean, they were trying to make her look like a sexy young Indiana Jones. And I just remember, like, this was like the first game where I just remember the sexualization being pushed everywhere. But playing as a kid, my brother had this game on the PlayStation, and I never owned it myself. Even though I did have a PlayStation. So when I was playing this game with my brother, there was a lot of late nights and a lot of, like, when I was visiting and stuff. And this game was so incredibly difficult to play because of the controls. 100% the controls. I didn't, we never made it very far in this game. At the time, my favorite games were Quake. Unreal Tournament had been out at that time. And the level design and everything, looking at the Tomb Raider, like the blocky levels and everything, the super straight lines on everything,
Yeah.
because they couldn't
the
put
really
the,
basic level geometry.
I love that. I love that stuff because it reminds me so much of childhood, and really every time I see a game like that, it will remind me of Quake and Quake 2 and Unreal Tournament. And I love all that stuff, and it's just such a it's just got nostalgia dripping all over it. It's such a snapshot to the 90s. But when we were trying to play this game, the controls were so bad. I was used to playing, like, I wasn't a big fan of third person stuff because Quake was my introduction into action video games. So I was all about first person, but I was used to playing on PC, and we were playing this on my brother's PlayStation, and the controls were radically different compared to using mouse and keyboard. And when I was playing PlayStation, my main game was Tony Hawk, which at the time, like, that game, the controls were just, they still hold up as being super smooth and just amazing, and the controls were just flawless in the Tony Hawk games. So then you had this big, tanky, awkward, punishing game where I remember progression was very slow. It kind of had that Resident Evil feeling where, like, the controls were bad, which made the game harder. Like, like, had you had good controls on this game would have been way easier. But because the controls were so bad, I remember just freaking out as a kid because I was getting attacked by dogs in this game, and, like, I couldn't shake them off me. Like, does anybody else have that experience?
Oh, it was when you'd get stuck in a corner so you couldn't get away from them.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Now, thankfully, luckily, compared to other games at the time, it had some sort of auto aim built into it, didn't it? Or like lock on targeting or something, or
Yes.
yeah.
You
So
also
I mean,
had you have infinite ammo, which is another big
yeah,
benefit.
yeah. Well, because I mean, and the big focus, which I do appreciate in this game, the focus really wasn't on combat. Well, sort of. I mean, and you had weapon upgrades and all that stuff. So I mean, it was a good mix. looking back on it, it was a good mix. But I also do remember at the time, like I said, I was playing Quake a lot and Tony Hawk, but I was playing Quake, and in Quake the levels were pretty cool and pretty big. But in Tomb Raider, like for some reason, like when you're exploring those caverns and like the tombs and like the Colosseum and stuff like that, like the levels just felt big and spacious. And one thing I do remember as a kid, like there was no soundtrack to. Well, I mean, there's a soundtrack, but there was no music blasting at you the whole time. Like you felt like you were in this big empty space, and the game was very, at the time, different compared to everything I was playing. But it was also, and that was a good thing and a bad thing. But I suppose it kind of sums it up for me. It was a mixed bag, my childhood experiences, because it was cool, it was different, but it was hard and punishing, and and honestly, I never really got into it after that.
Cory, what are your thoughts?
My early childhood was not very Tomb Raider centric. A lot of this was like tangentially related to me. Like there was a huge marketing campaign behind this game. I think this was probably Eidos's flagship title after they picked up Crystal Dynamics. So this is like just after Gex and Legacy of Kain at this point, I think.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
they were really pushing like this brand new thing that they were trying to do.
And it seemed like PlayStation was too, like in general,
Yeah,
because
well,
PlayStation.
yeah,
Yeah.
PlayStation was also looking for a American market at this point too, because a lot of the stuff we had prior to this was a lot of smaller developers and a lot of like Japanese ports. You know, it's like I remember we had a lot of like weird like overseas stuff coming in where it was like that Wild West of the PlayStation era. But really, I didn't play Tomb Raider probably until like my early 20s when they were putting out like a lot of the sequels. I mean, the original game, I think I played the demo that came in like the PlayStation magazine because I had a subscription to like PSX or whatever it was. But a lot of it really was just the marketing campaign. Like they were really pushing this, and like Sean said, like they're like full size cutouts of like Laura Croft, and they had this kind of everywhere, and it was at all the game stores. And then they did end up making like the movie spin-off and everything. So like there was really a big marketing drive behind this, and I think that was a combination of PlayStation really pushing for like a US market and Sony trying to get everything locked down. And I think as far as that goes, they really knocked it out of the park. But as far as my childhood goes, like I just remember this being kind of like, to me it was a novelty. Like I just as playing the demo, like as we're talking about, like the controls really janky, and which is fine for the time. Like a lot of games had like really hard controls. I mean, we talk about Resident Evil, that being as big a title as it is. Like they had tank controls in that game, so it was just impossible to play. And I think that's to its credit, that made it a lot scarier as well, which is the whole goal of the game. But that's not here or there. But yeah, like I just thought it was like this cool platformer, and like you had a female character, which was more or less unheard of at this point. And it was just this fun little thing for me to screw around with. But I personally didn't really get on like the Tomb Raider train until like much later in life with the re-releases and like them, making a finished polished product.
Can I just chip in on like the idea of PlayStation pushing Tomb Raider, and they definitely were putting like posters, cutouts everywhere, but also the fact that I'm pretty sure, Sean, feel free to fact check me on this, but the first 3 games came out 1 year after another. The second one came out in 97, the third one came out in 98. Like they were trying to pump these out because they were trying to build a franchise, and they were really trying to establish themselves and
I think you're correct on that.
Yes. Yes. The second one came out in November of 1997.
Yeah, so they were really trying to make this unforgettable, make it so you could not ignore Tomb Raider.
They actually had 6 in this timeline version up to 2003 Angel of Darkness on the PlayStation 2. And I will say to your point, Cory, when you said, well, it was normal for a lot of games then. The janky controls were still there in 2003. I remember playing Angel of Darkness, and it had some stuff that was so horrific. I remember any time you'd go around a corner, and when she'd be pressed against the wall and like sidling sideways, and goes around a corner, it would zoom the camera in. Sorry.
You're all right. I'm saying you're just doing that like whole Mission Impossible slide where you like pressed up against the wall.
Yes, exactly that. And for some reason, I started doing it in real life then as well while I was describing it. But it would sometimes zoom the camera in to inside Lara's face, and you'd get this horrific visual of her face inside out.
Inside out, yeah. My God.
It was awful, and I remember having to, every time I was going around the corner, looking away from the screen in case it did it again, and so I wouldn't have to see it. And it had all sorts of issues like this. I mean, I remember them fondly, but I remember at one point accidentally jumping off a really, really high ledge, panicking, pausing the game, thinking, how do I fix this? Saving the game, thinking it will restart me when I was back on the ledge. But no, every time I opened that save game, it would start with her falling to her death. I think that the janky controls kind of permeated that entire 6 games, as far as I'm aware, and the camera angles and things like that. But I do kind of remember them fondly. But like you said, it's definitely what made the game difficult.
Well, and part of the reason for that might just be the fact that they were pushing these out so close together. Like, they really didn't have time to develop a new engine or clean anything up, because it's like, well, we finished this one, we better start making 9 more stages for the next one.
And it's selling well, and everybody's used to the controls now. Why change it?
Yeah, but then it got to that point with Angel of Darkness, it was seen so bad that Eidos actually then gave up and gave it away to Crystal Dynamics, and they switched over to Crystal Dynamics to develop them, because Angel of Darkness just did so poorly.
Well, Angel of Darkness sold over 2.5 million copies, but it was reviewed horribly. Which, yes, this game came out on the PlayStation 2 in 2003? And it was still developed by Core Design, published by Eidos. And to me, the things that you're describing are unacceptable at this point in time, because you had so many other better games that came out on the PlayStation 2, because that system itself is just one of the greatest selling systems of all time. So you had to be a top tier developer to even crack a successful market. But somehow they were able to sell almost 2.5 million copies. And I think this is an instance where the character drove the franchise and not the game and gameplay itself.
Completely. Yeah.
Because when I think of Lara Croft, I think of, like we discussed already, a badass female Indiana Jones. But she has her own identity as well. I'm not taking that away from her. But Lara Croft is a badass. She's just got this awesome backstory, and I love everything about her. But what I don't like is the fact that almost all the games were horrible until it came for the reboots that arrived on the PlayStation 3.
It's interesting you mentioned about, obviously she's a badass, but there was very little defining her character other than that. There was very little story that happened.
Yeah, I was actually trying to think. I'm like, wait, what is her backstory? I knew, like, she's rich, right? So she's kind of like
Croft Manor.
Yeah.
So there's a thing in Tomb Raider 2 where Winston the butler would follow you around everywhere, and you could lock him in the freezer.
Yeah. So
but it was never really fully explained in any given detail. You get bits and pieces and hints of things.
So she's like Bruce Wayne of archaeology.
Even in this first game, like, you hear about how your dad's dead or whatever, and you're, looking for Atlantis, which is the whole like premise of the game. And there's some like bits and pieces hinted at where like he was well on his way, and then now he's dead, and like his whole like research team or whatever, like, gave up on him or something, or like didn't have the fortitude to follow through with whatever they needed to do. and like it really doesn't fill anything in for you.
Well,
Yeah,
it also doesn't tell you much about Lara. It tells you about her dad, not about her.
I think that it does say not a ton because this is obviously an early title, but in the manual itself, it talks about how Laura was originally raised to be an aristocrat, that she attended a finishing school that she completed by 21. It talks about her kind of life before becoming an archaeologist because it talks about unable to stand the claustrophobic, suffocating atmosphere of upper class British society, she realized that she was only truly alive when she was traveling alone. And over the following 8 years, she acquired an intimate knowledge of ancient civilizations across the globe. So it kind of talks about a little bit about her motivations to become the archaeologist that she became.
And this goes back to why I hate manuals and why Sean reads them every time we screw with the video game.
I was actually going to say, you've just reminded me about how much I loved and miss game manuals.
It's become an ongoing thing. I download and I read through every single manual, every single page, because it started with a game called Shinobi 3, where I didn't check out the manual and I struggled so
Sean did not know how to
much.
use any of his jutsus, and he was running around without using like any of his special powers.
So it made what turned out to be an amazing game. It made it incredibly difficult, and I initially disliked it pretty heavily. So since then, I've been like, you know what? Every manual, because that's something that we do as children. And you mentioned, Devin, how you miss them. That's like the first thing you checked out as a kid, because you're usually coming back.
I wouldn't even wait to get home. As soon as I bought a new game, I'd be sat in the back of the car reading the manual so that I was ready to play it when I got back, but also just because I couldn't wait to read the manual.
And the manual itself doesn't really tell you a lot. Even here, it does have that short blurb about a little bit of her history, but when discussing like the movement and actions that she has, it will briefly describe like what buttons to press, but it does not prepare you for those controls. And oh, I had a question for you. Speaking of controls, did you ever manage to beat the game using the flight controller that you had?
It's a very good question. I think we did get there eventually. I think that I remember playing with my dad, we'd pass it back and forth on things. I was a little bit more tenacious and stubborn than he was, a death or two, and he'd be ready to go. And I keep going and trying. We did get there eventually from my memory, but let me tell you, it was slow going. And almost all of the deaths were just Lara falling to her death. They weren't from the combats. As you said, it's not a very combat-oriented game. But because of the janky controls, the camera angles, you would be constantly falling to your death.
And really quickly, this talks about the other games. When did you make the switch from using that flight controller to playing on a different system, or
as soon as I could
Tomb
switch
Raider?
to PlayStation. So I don't know why we had the first 3 basically on PC, and so I played them through that. The 4th and the 5th ones, I don't think I ever played. We didn't get them on PlayStation, so then I jumped to PlayStation 2 with Angel of Darkness. So it wasn't until that point that I got to try out an actual controller.
That is such a fascinating history. Cory, thank you. Thank you for bringing Devin on the show, because this has added so much to it. And it's actually kind of changing my opinion a little bit, because I've been talking to these guys for a few weeks now, and I've not been kind to this game. But I think that we have kind of exhausted our childhood memories. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to discuss replaying Tomb Raider in 2023. So this is a segment where we're going to talk about Laura, and as we're replaying the game here in 2023 on various different platforms. I played it on Steam myself, and I know Cory, you did as well, right?
Yes.
All right, and so we're going to discover what other people played it on, but I want to talk about how the game starts initially. So there's a small cutscene, and the game will start with Laura being escorted by a guide in the mountains of Peru. And the first thing that I notice is that she's wearing what looks to be a serape covering her t-shirt and Daisy Dukes. And I realize that this is an early 3D game and space is definitely a factor, but how much more room would it have taken to give her a proper outfit to match the environment that she's in?
Absolutely none, given that you can get a bunch of different outfit changes.
It's just
But you
something
don't
that
actually get them in
bothers
the
me.
game.
These are just things that frustrate me. And when we talk about frustration, this game was relatively new to me. I'd played it on these demo discs that you only got maybe a few minutes or maybe a small segment of a level. But after I started playing, within the first 5 minutes, I stopped, I closed Steam, and then went straight to Google. The reason I went to Google is because I was looking up when was the Sega Saturn released, because that was the first platform that came out. And it came out in November of 1994 in Japan. The original PlayStation was released in December of 1996. And I talked about how there were plans to put this game on the Nintendo 64, which it was released in June in 1996. So what am I getting at? As I said, development of this game has started in 1994 with the first planned release being on the Sega Saturn, which didn't have an analog stick, and neither did the PlayStation at the time. However, the Nintendo 64 did, and although the controller itself is a bit unorthodox, and we talked about that in our Star Fox episode, it wasn't until August of 1997 that the PlayStation finally got an analog controller, and Tomb Raider 2 would be released around 2 months later in November 1997. I realize that's a lot of dates and everything, but the point I'm trying to make is that the controls are just flat out awful. And you mentioned them a little bit, Devin, but they are bad. They are so bad, and it's jarring when you compare it to games of the time, like Mario 64, which was amazing. The controls were so fluid and felt natural, and controlling Mario was fun. And that was a part of the game itself. You had Mario outside of the castle where you were free to explore and there were no dangers and you could just do whatever. And it was fun and engaging. But here I felt like I was fighting the controls every time I moved Laura. And it's not just the controls, it's the camera. That was my other enemy. I felt like I didn't need puzzles or animals or enemies. I had the controls and the camera, and I met the final boss 30 seconds into the game.
You mentioned right at the start about what she was wearing, and I actually also went to Google straight as I started the game because it'd been so long since I played it to check to make sure I hadn't somehow got something messed up in the settings, because she started out in the snow wearing a sleeveless tank top and short shorts, and it's like, have I somehow got something where she's put an outfit on for the whole game and it's not the ones that she should be wearing? Because I'd of course played it on something that I played previously, and I actually had a previous save game which I had to delete, and I thought maybe there's just something left over from the previous save game. But no, she just starts in an icy, snowy mountain in short shorts and a vest top.
And you told us, but can you tell the audience how you played this game?
Yeah, so I broke out my old Xbox 360 to play this. I had the anniversary edition on the 360, so I pulled that out. And I have to say, you're talking about janky controls. Let me tell you, that's not the only thing that was janky about it. Like I said, I had the save game. You could not start a new save game. There was no option to start a new save game. It took me a while to even work out how to start the game in the first place, because I played it previously on the Xbox. I then had to find out through Google that what I needed to do was delete the existing save game to be able to start the game again. And that led on to more problems during my playthrough, because when I started my new game, having deleted my old save game, it doesn't delete everything. So I was getting to places being like, it's making the sound that there's an artifact or a relic here, and there's nothing here. And somehow it had kept the progress of the artifacts and the relics I'd collected on my previous playthrough, despite the fact I'd started a brand new game. So I could still get to those places and they'd just be empty, but they'd still make the sound as though there was something there, which drove me wild at times when I was looking for something that just didn't exist anymore.
Huh.
I can't imagine how frustrating that would be, but at least you have some knowledge of how the game should work. I'm coming at it fresh. So, in my experience, that first area, the caves, the geometry of the level and the bland color palette made everything look like everything else. I had walked past the ledge that led to the larger part of the cavern several times because I could not differentiate the textures. And if you remember the game, if you just keep going forward, there is a small block that has this like very sharp angle, and behind it is a small opening. What I learned later on is that you can jump off that rock into that opening to secure a med pack, and it's actually a secret area. I thought that that was perhaps the level like looped around in on itself, and that's where I would end up at, but it's not the case. And instead, I struggled just trying to do basic things like jumping or orienting my camera was a pain. It was just such a tedious thing that I had no fun, and it just got worse as the game progressed.
I think it's an interesting one with the differentiating the textures and knowing where to go and things, because on one hand, it's kind of awesome that the game doesn't hold your hand and paint things in yellow that you're meant to interact with. And it's quite cool in that way that it's more of a puzzle, but at the same time, it's also incredibly frustrating. There's no mini map. And I realized it took me hours into the game to realize that what I was really missing was a mini map, because there are times when in that first area in Peru, you have to actually go back the way you came. And I kept stopping myself and thinking, oh no, this is where I came from. This isn't the right way. And I go look for another way out because I'm so used to video games having, unless they're an RPG or something, having a more linear path than that. So you don't go back where you came from, you keep pressing forwards. So I kept getting thrown about by the fact that there's all that repetition of areas, and not just repetition of areas when you're progressing through, but also when you're finding those hidden areas. Sometimes you've got to go all the way through a whole series of jumps and obstacles and go left to get to a hidden area, go back down and do the entire obstacle course again, but just go right this time for something different. So you ended up with a lot of repetition if you wanted to collect everything.
And the game does have a lot of secrets, but most of those secrets are really just additional med packs. It's not something substantial that
And ammo.
and ammo, but you have automatic unlimited ammo, I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have unlimited ammo with your initial twin pistols, and then you can get
Not
the
the
shotgun.
upgrades, yeah.
I will say you've got relics and artifacts, which are the like proper collectibles in the game that are more meaningful. You know, if you collect them, they get displayed in Croft Manor and things, at least in the anniversary edition. So they're considered the most meaningful ones. They usually have a little bit of lore or history attached to them, a bit of information about what the artifact is, that kind of archaeological idea. I think most of it's made up, but it's something that's at least a little bit more significant than the med packs. And they're the ones that make the jangly noises when you are near them or you find them. But it's whether that's worth it to you. And it's never clear whether the route you're going down and spending lots of time going down is where you actually need to go to progress the game, or if it's going to take you into some hidden location for something that you may or may not be interested in collecting.
And I don't mind that. I don't mind earlier games that didn't have these quality of life improvements like a mini map and things like that, because I've grown up playing a lot of RPGs and adventure games where that wasn't an option and you just kind of had to figure things out for yourself, or that collective communal effort from other people that were playing the game. That's not my problem with this game. If I could explore without the difficulty and frustration of the controls, I think I would have been a much happier person.
Chris and Cory, what were you playing on?
Yeah.
I was waiting for something. I briefly played on the original PlayStation 2, actually, but I'll admit I not a fan of the replay. The controls are just like we said already. The controls are so bad. This is one of the occasions where the game, back when I remember playing the game and have like memories of the game, everything seemed so much bigger. And then when I actually replayed it, dusted off the PlayStation, replayed it, nothing loads in. And that I don't know if that's just my PlayStation dying. Like nothing was loading in 30 feet past my game. So I got incredibly frustrated, and I'm not ashamed to say this game sucks replaying it. So I gave up pretty quickly on it, and I had, my childhood memories are great, but I didn't get far at all. I didn't even get past the first level replaying it this time before I just got frustrated.
Really?
I was like, yeah, I gave up. Then the controls are so
Wow.
bad. Yep, not a.
It's not
So
even really a long game either. I mean, it probably took me. I played it on the Anniversary Collection. I played it on Steam using a 360 controller. Um, it took me, I don't know, maybe like 12 hours or so to get through it. And I'm sure like you can probably do it much faster than that. A lot of that time was just me spent trying to figure out like where to go and what to do
the
and stuff.
the anniversary. Did you guys have save states
Yeah, there were checkpoints, automatically saved checkpoints.
and not the little memory crystal things or whatever?
No, it just saves for you.
Yeah, I should have looked for a newer version, and nope.
Yeah, so what, and I mean I only paid $1, so in your face. But yeah, like I had the automatic grip on, so apparently unlike Sean, I did not have to push another button to grab onto walls. Um, my biggest enemy, all right, as far as controls go, it is archaic and it is a fight to have to deal with the camera, especially because the camera actually affects how your character moves. Like if you're trying to jump a gap, especially if you're like going backwards or something, you actually have to turn the camera in a certain direction. Otherwise, your jump button will not function the way it's supposed to. So that's one of like the most annoying things about this. But my arch nemesis personally was the grapple mechanic. For whatever reason, I could not get like the zip line to function properly, and I would have to jump like 7 or 8 times to actually get it to like swing out and not just drop off immediately. So like that was probably my biggest issue with this game.
That's really interesting. I actually thought as I was playing and I got to having the grapple, I thought, wow, I forgot how good the grapple was.
Maybe it's just because I didn't like taking the leap of faith. I wanted to get the grapple to work while I'm still standing on solid ground. So that's probably what the issue was. But like it, for whatever reason, I just was not having a good time with the grapple mechanic. But as far as like the whole gameplay goes, I found it acceptable. Um, obviously this is kind of like a story-driven like adventure title, and there's a lot of fun like little puzzles, and there's a lot of like traps and pitfalls and booby traps and stuff. Honestly, like combat to me felt like an afterthought. And I think that's really evident in the fact that a lot of the enemies are just bullet sponges. And even the final boss is just like an endurance trial. Like you just have to sit there and just pump round after round into this character until they finally die. I think that if you didn't have to deal with combat, I think there'd be like still a solid game here. So that was kind of like one of the surprising things to me is just like how much of a chore almost it was to have to just shoot things. And I mean, I love having the infinite ammo and having Laura with her two like dual 45s just wasting stuff, but for the most part like it just felt really tedious.
I
Not
absolutely agree on that. I think that the combat felt more like it was just a minor nuisance or an obstacle to get you to the next part of the puzzle or next part of the navigating, right? It really felt like it was not a main focus of the
Right,
game.
and a lot of the creatures just felt like they were just there to just delay you and to just take up time. Like
just to make sure
Exactly.
you're still awake.
Yeah, like I mean, not even like a lot of them, you're fighting just these wolves and bears and stuff in this like, even like in Peru in the first level, and a lot of them are just like, okay, just back up a lot and just keep unloading rounds into them, and then finally they're done with. But they're really just a distraction more than anything. I think like they weren't really hard. I took a lot more damage from like mistiming my way through the spear traps and stuff than I did from any of the enemies.
Oh, totally. I'd say for most people, the majority of the damage you're going to take is from falling or for environmental damage.
Absolutely. I found it was rare for me to have any concerns or issues with the fighting other than minor nuisances of timing. By the time you work out how to do the adrenaline dodge and shoot, like combat becomes a minor obstacle, and it really is going to be you're falling to death rather than anything else that's creating that repeat experience that you're failing at.
I want to say that for me, because I don't have experience with it, I would hear the bats, and sometimes due to the camera, I wouldn't necessarily see them. And once the bats get close enough to you, that's it. They're going to take almost half of your health bar because you can't auto aim correctly and they won't shoot. I had so many problems with this game, and I believe that there's a good game buried under here. It's just trapped with poor camera and poor controls.
I think the good game is the remastered and the reboot versions of this game. Like
That too.
And unfortunately, like I said, I never got into Tomb Raider after playing this as a high school. I never got into the reboots or anything, but I've heard they are absolutely fantastic. They aren't how I spend most of my time gaming, so I never played them.
2018 plus.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean those are pretty critically acclaimed hits as far as I know.
Yeah, I've heard of like all the newer games on the more modern systems or the modern this gen consoles are just amazing games, and they're beautiful and well done and great story and good action and good controls.
I mean, honestly, even the 2007 like remaster that I played, I didn't think it looked bad. I mean, obviously there were issues like Sean was talking about where sometimes the background, like the whole palette would just kind of blend in and you weren't really sure what to grab and what not to grab. But as far as them like retexturing everything, I thought they did a pretty solid job, especially for 2007.
No, in the remasters, like I said, I didn't really play this. I didn't put much time in this at all. But as a kid, I remember like all these secrets and all the, like you said, there wasn't anything painted yellow saying, hey, you need to go here, or hey, this wall is climbable. It was more or less, you'd see these little, Sean, I'm going to stumble on some words here, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But you remember how in Quake 1 and Quake 2, all the little thing, like there'd be little notches sticking on the wall that for some reason your character would be able to jump on, and a full grown man would be able to stay on this tiny little thing sticking out of the wall.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. I remember playing Tomb Raider as a kid. Like a lot of the stuff, like the climbable walls, like you just had to look for like, why is there a block sticking out of a wall right here? But it kind of blends in. Like nothing was obvious. And I was just wondering, in the remaster, did they clean that up, or is it still, were you still just kind of looking for these little?
I mean, it
out of
certainly
place
differentiated. It certainly made it a lot clearer, in my opinion. Like it really didn't look like a Mario 64 kind of deal.
I played through all three of the reboot trilogy, and I actually platinumed the first two games because I loved it. It was what I wanted this to be, but obviously there's a huge gap in time and, just kind of industry development. But the remakes of Tomb Raider were essentially like carbon copies of the Nathan Drake Uncharted series.
I've heard that comparison a lot. And to be fair, I think Tomb Raider, the game itself, the series, really paved the way for games like Uncharted and stuff like that. And those games drew a lot of inspiration from Tomb Raider.
So I mean, there's a large argument that Nathan Drake is just the male Lara Croft.
Exactly. So
yeah.
So I don't want to say like I haven't played the reboots, but with that history behind Tomb Raider, is the reboot of Tomb Raider just a ripoff of Nathan Drake and Uncharted, or is Uncharted just they're both just following the natural progression of Tomb Raider?
I think it's worth clarifying because it keeps saying about reboot. There's actually been 2 reboot sets of Tomb Raider. So there's the initial 6 Tomb Raider games. Then they rebooted Tomb Raider with Tomb Raider Legend, and that's then followed by Anniversary and Underworld. So Anniversary, although it's a remake of the first game, is also part of the first set of reboot of Tomb Raider. And then there was a new reboot done again, which started in 2013, which is just called Tomb Raider. And I think they're the reboots you're talking about, rather than the first reboots, which was Legend, Anniversary, and Underworld.
That's why I've been trying to use the word remaster instead.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because clearly they keep trying to redo and rework how can we make Tomb Raider work in today's games. So it's not the first time that they've gone, okay, we need to change things up a little bit. We need to do things differently. We need to progress with the times. So actually, you could say that Nathan Drake games were following on from the first initial set of reboots of Tomb Raider games, and then when the second set of reboots of Tomb Raider games is again, they were just keeping up with the current industry, but still sticking with the roots of doing what they've always done, finding the artifacts, puzzle type gameplay. The combat is what I'd say is significantly improved in the 2013 onward reboots, and that's where the combat is actually an integral part of the gameplay as opposed to just feeling like it was tacked on as it was in the initial games.
I agree with you. And there's definitely criticisms for both Uncharted and the 2013 onward reboot of Tomb Raider. And those criticisms to me are really the combat, because you have Lara Croft, who's supposed to be an archaeologist, the 2013 game especially, where it has been quite some time since I played, nearly 10 years, where she is just this young girl. She's 21 years old. And by midway the game, she's a hardened killer, just mercilessly killing dozens and dozens and dozens of people. And even in the sequel to that, or maybe it's the third in the game trilogy, but there's one point where she's in a village and she's expressly told, like, don't remove this artifact, do not do it, it'll bring about the cataclysm. She ignores all that, does it, and then you watch it's an interactive cutscene essentially, where it destroys this entire village, killing everyone involved. And to me, I think that although I really enjoyed these games for what they were, it really bothered me how they kind of tainted the legacy of Lara Croft and made her into this monster, essentially.
Well, and
that's super interesting. If I can, sorry, Cory, but I really want to mention that I actually looked, when I was looking at the differences with the first game versus the Anniversary remake, that's something that they specifically changed, because in the very first initial release of Tomb Raider, Lara kills and she doesn't care. She doesn't even blink an eye when killing. She doesn't seem to mind that much that she lost her guide at the very start of the Peru opening. Whereas in Anniversary, they have this change slightly in the storyline and the cinematics, where the first kill she makes, she's horrified and she ends up like shaking hands. She hates that she's had to do it. It becomes a whole thing later on when you meet more of the henchmen, where she doesn't want to kill them, but she knows she might have to defend herself, etc. In fact, even with the final boss, and she says something, this is who you are, you're just as evil inside as I am, kind of thing. And there was this really interesting scene right at the end, the very last cutscene of the game, where she drives off in the boat and she's leaving the exploding island behind her, and she looks down at her hands, which is where she'd had the whole shaking hands, you know, obviously had the whole blood on her hands thing in her mind before. And she looks down at them and they're fine, and she kind of smirks. And it's basically just she's now a cold-blooded killer, it felt like to me. But certainly in the initial game, she is. So it's interesting to hear the idea that it taints her legacy when her initial legacy was actually a cold-blooded killer in a way.
I feel like they made her out to be so much more horrific in the 2013 onward reboot. But that's just my interpretation of my feelings of it, because I don't have too much intimate knowledge like you do of the original games, because I had never really played them. And I did play through this Anniversary edition. That's what it was on Steam, right, Cory?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I played through that, and while I did kind of get a little bit of that she has kind of changed fundamentally as a person, I just feel that these games that had come out later on, it was just almost non-existent. There is a brief time that she's like, "Oh my god, I killed someone," but that almost immediately goes away. And like I said, there's a huge criticism with Nathan Drake where he just mows down 200 dudes throughout your playthrough.
Yeah, Nathan Drake is much more of a he's the bad guy in Indiana Jones, really. Like he's just Belloc. Like it's like, God, screw the natives. Like I need my stuff. Like, oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm honestly not a fan of the Uncharted series, and I know that's probably going to upset some people, but that's just how it is. I just don't like those games. Gotta
Speaking of
caveat that.
Renee Belloc, did you know that the actor Paul Freeman is Ivan Ooze in the Power Rangers film?
No.
Yeah. So in the original Indiana Jones, Belloc, the like guy in the white suit that is fighting Indiana Jones, he's actually Ivan Ooze in the Power Ranger films.
Who's
Look it up.
that?
What?
Oh well, no. Let's not go
I never
that way.
I never got into Power Rangers.
All right. Well, we'll curb that conversation for something else, but that's really fascinating. But back to the gameplay, I just feel like I I could only play for about 30-minute intervals until I just became so frustrated with the controls that I had to stop and play a different game. And Chris was talking about Quake. That was the game that I would go to because I was already on Steam. So I would just close out of Lara Croft and I would just boot up Quake. And even though the geometry is fairly similar, there not a whole lot of, I mean, just the computers of this time, you're looking at 133s, 233s. You might have a 400 megahertz processor if you were really pumping out some money. So there's not a lot of geometry.
Get them old Pentiums.
Yeah, and when it comes to like graphics cards and everything, like a Voodoo or a Voodoo 2 was several hundreds of dollars. So the 3D effects options just weren't there. But I imagine that it was just so much worse without like having a graphics card to really power this game. I can see where the character drove the franchise. If it was a male protagonist, I don't think Tomb Raider would have gotten anywhere because these games aren't good. That's my hot take.
Marketing, yeah. Marketing drove this game.
I think that you are right to an extent. I don't think they're as bad as you're looking at them now. I think they were the controls especially were a lot like more forgiving if you're looking at it through a like 1996 console lens, especially for something that was developed for like 3 different systems, because you said it was DOS, it was PlayStation, and it was Sega CD, right? So
Sega
I
Saturn.
think Sega Saturn. So as fast as they were trying to like pump these out, I think that, this is probably not too terrible of a control setup for 1996 for like a multi-platform port.
Yeah, but as Devin brought up, this game came out every single year from 1996 all the way to 2003.
Right, and as Chris mentioned, there was one a year, and I think part of the problem is that they never took time to like clean anything up. They were just pumping it out to make money on the franchise.
And that's unacceptable.
Well, I completely agree, but as far as the original success of the project goes, I think that like if we're just looking at the first game, I don't think it's as bad as it may feel as far as today goes. Like as a whole,
expectations have changed and what we expect games to do have changed. So when you try and go back, it feels very like it's missing things. So for this, I felt like the pacing was off because there was just so much. It was all stitched together. There were no real breaks. There were no real all that many cutscenes to break it up, which again, that's something we're used to now, but wasn't really a thing at the time so much. But if you stitch together all the cutscenes of a 10, 12-hour game, it's about 15 minutes worth of cutscenes. Hence why it felt like there was very little story and very little narrative. It was there, but it was fairly bare bones. We're not used to that today. If you compare that to either of the sets of reboots, it was so different. You had a lot more verbalizations, you had a lot more ongoing narrative throughout, which therefore changed the pacing and broke things up a little bit more. So the pacing definitely felt something that was, like you were saying, Sean, about can only play about half an hour at the time. Part of that is in terms of the controls, and part being that then didn't feel like there were many natural stopping points for you to just take a break from those controls for a minute and do something else, which the combat did a little bit, but the combat wasn't great and all that enjoyable, so it didn't really feel like much of a break. What I'll say is I think that the controls weren't so bad once I got used to them and I kind of fell back into that natural, okay, I now remember how to do this. It was mostly the camera angles, I think, that really threw me off. And what I actually found was playing it was easier when you just kept taking leaps of faith, because chances are there was something there, just because you couldn't see it. There was probably something there that you'll get thrown onto. And again, if you've got that automatic grip on with the anniversary edition, that makes therefore things easier for those leaps of faith. But it did mean that a lot of the time you just kind of have to throw yourself into a situation rather than what I'd normally do with puzzles, and certainly in the newest reboot series, stop and take my time and think about how do I solve this.
And I
Finish your first
understand.
hits, eat yourself off of stuff.
And I understand that this is still in the infancy of 3D polygonal games, a true 3D space where your character is moving about them. I get it. I understand it. And I do try to look through the lens of a person in 1996, because you mentioned that, Cory. But to me, when I'm playing this, I can't, because I see the progression of games, 96, 97, 98, all the way to 2003. I kind of take the sins of the progressive games and I blast the ones because they didn't go back and fix it. They had the chance, they had the opportunity,
Right.
but chose not to.
And I mean, if you're talking about the franchise as a whole, I certainly feel that they were lazy and money grabbing as far as things went on. But if we're just looking at it from just the original title, I don't think it's as bad as all that.
I remember playing. My 2 cents is just to rehash on my childhood memories, playing the original title on the PlayStation and actively going, "This sucks. I'm playing something else," because the controls were so bad and because the gameplay was, the graphics were your classic PlayStation graphics, but the game experience itself, obviously I had much better gameplay experience playing other PlayStation games because that's what I kept switching to. Like, I mean, it could have definitely been better, and this game was definitely market driven. This game was selling because of marketing, not because of groundbreaking gameplay.
Also, can we talk about how at one point Steve Bloom shows up to chastise us?
Well, go for it.
At one point, Steve Bloom shows up to chastise us. I don't know. I just wanted to bring that up. I just like the fact that basically the whole concept of this game is that we're looking for these 3 fragments that will take us to a portion of Atlantis that will, I don't know, bring about some sort of apocalypse. And when you put together 2 of the pieces, like midway through the game, there is a point where there's a cutscene that happens where you find these like 3 ancient Atlantean overlords or whatever, and one of them's Cowboy Bebop. So that's fun.
I think we've kind of gotten to the point that we've basically expressed as much as we could about how we feel about this game. I'd like to close out this segment, take a quick break, and when we come back, discuss our final thoughts. Are you guys all kind of agreeable for that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've got one other thing that I'd thought about and really stood out to me, actually, which was, I remember when there was a pop-up that said you can see Lara's thoughts in her journal. And I thought, I've just fought a T-Rex. I want to see what Lara's thoughts are. And not only could I not actually access the journal because it says you can find it in your inventory, but you can't open your inventory except when trying to interact with something to add something from your inventory, for example, adding a cog to some kind of mechanism. It's the only time you can actually access your inventory, or at least in the version I was playing, that was the case. So I couldn't find Lara's thoughts after certain things had happened. And when you could, it was literally, I wonder what goes here, or this seems to be broken. And that was the extent of it. And I thought, there is all this stuff that's happening that's absolutely wild. Like, there are just randomly velociraptors and a T-Rex in the middle of Peru, and there is absolutely zero commentary on it. There is nothing that recognizes the fact that this is strange, especially in an otherwise somewhat realistic setting. And then I remembered that, well, maybe I'm just putting my thoughts from having more recently played the reboots, where it was a normal setting and then the supernatural stood out as being not normal, to the original games where maybe it wasn't so strange that there were randomly T-Rexes in the world, but it's never really addressed. And that's something that kind of got me, that why wasn't this addressed?
Well, little do you know that Jurassic Park and Tomb Raider take place in the same world, so everyone is totally cool with the idea of velociraptors.
Got it.
With all that said, let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to discuss our final thoughts of Tomb Raider. Welcome back, everyone. Cory, I'm going to start myself off here by quoting a conversation I had with your brother, because we were talking about Street Fighter. I was like, hey, I love to play Street Fighter with you, but I'm trying to play through Tomb Raider. I'm struggling. And he kind of asked some leading questions about why I wasn't enjoying it. And this is what I had to say, and I'm going to quote it here, and it's not kind. And I said, I never played it when I was younger, so I don't have any nostalgia keeping me afloat. And aside from the poor controls, the awful level geometry, wonky hitboxes, and just hideous visuals, I felt that there was a good game under there, but I had to struggle to find it. And our conversation eventually fractured off and we talked about other video games, but I think that Tomb Raider is important. And I think it's important for a lot of different reasons. The gaming industry needed and still needs more female protagonists. So I think that in itself is good. And I think that, like you had mentioned earlier, Devin, that they have kind of made Laura a more natural looking character instead of that, what we talked about earlier, where she's just horribly out of proportion. And they even carry that over into the film with Angelina Jolie, which was absolutely unnecessary. But I'm grateful for Tomb Raider because it did bring about a lot of female fans into the gaming space that may not have otherwise done so. I've thrashed the game enough. I'd like to hear you guys' thoughts about the game. And Chris, why don't you start us off?
I'm just going to piggyback on. I do have memories of this game, but all my memories were of me not liking it. So I really, I don't have any nostalgia to hang on to. I guess this game just made me want to go back and play Quake instead. Like,
it's so weird that that's your tie-in for this one.
Same with me.
That's what I was playing at the time.
I know, but it's just it's just so odd.
And seriously, well, as far as like adventure games, I think of Quake, especially like 96, 98. Quake
is okay.
Yeah, and then pick up a PlayStation controller. I think of Tony Hawk. So I don't have a lot of ties to this game. I would not recommend, as far as replayability. This is not one that I'm going to recommend for anybody to go back and replay. This is not one I'm going to try to get my son to play down the road. Like, if he wants to play the remasters, reboots, the newer versions that I've heard great things about, go for it. But as far as...
On that note, Chris, I got to interrupt you.
Yeah.
They are horrifically violent. And that was one of the criticisms, that there are some
Oh
scenes
yeah.
where Laura Croft would be like impaled. Like
Impale.
she's rushing down a river and there
Oh my,
are these
that's
wooden
exactly what I was
spikes.
thinking of. I was
Yeah.
I watched I remember that Conan O'Brien was reviewing the new Lara Croft game and he was playing it himself, and that exact scene where she was going down the river and then got impaled by these wooden spikes, and on TV Conan O'Brien freaking out because he was not expecting that. So yeah, I mean, I should say I'm not going to recommend those games for my son, but I mean, like, if somebody wants to play the Lara Croft franchise, I'm not
I'm
going to point
assuming
them.
you're over 15 if you're listening to this.
Yeah, well, yeah. I'm not going to point anybody in the direction of the first 6 Lara Croft games from 2003 or before. They did not age well, so on to the next one.
Cory, and then Devin, I'd like you to bring us home.
As far as the game goes, it's not impressive. I think it was a really good title for the time. You know, as far as the control goes, like we've all had our gripes about it. As far as the franchise goes and the character and everything, I think that Laura Croft is probably the first female protagonist we've had in a video game. And I think that's super important. And up until this point, everyone that we've had before her was either someone that was like, your Princess Peach or your Zelda or like, Miss Pac-Man or whatever, like other minor characters. We talked about having like Chun-Li and Cammy and, Mortal Kombat and everything. But Laura Croft is really the first like solo anchor female character.
Samus.
Well, but you don't know Samus is a chick, and she's in
Yeah,
a
you had
robo
no
suit
idea.
like the
Yeah.
whole time. And even, like anyway, but like she's really like the first female character we've seen. And I think the only counterpart up to this point is probably, Resident Evil came out this same year and we got Jill Valentine. But even then, you still had like other characters in that game. So I think that Laura's, kind of anchoring this title, and it really did help kind of shoot off the fact that like you can have a female protagonist and you can have like women in video games. And we talked about how her proportions are a little ridiculous, but I don't think she's really dressed in a very like horrible way. Like she's in a tank top and she's got shorts or whatever, but I think that for the most part, like she is really just leading this big franchise and being a great, kind of role model in a sense, or a blueprint for other games. And I think that's super important. And I think that the later iterations, as far as like them making new versions of this and even cleaning up the remasters, like they did take their time to make it better and better. Um, like I said, the original, not great. If you want to see this, I would just say like watch a Let's Play, because I'm sure there's probably some 8-hour version there where you can just watch someone run through this where they know where they're going the whole time and they don't miss any jumps or whatever. There were some other things about this game that surprised me. There was the combat that was involved, and even though it wasn't very good, it's something that you really didn't see a lot as far as like adventure platforming went. Like we had kind of like Crash Bandicoot and stuff like that, and you had Mario, but there was not a lot of like combat. And there are some bosses in this game, and I think like even the two like Greek Guardian Centaur bosses that come up in this game, like that's actually a pretty well designed fight. So I think if they did more of that, like this would have been a much cooler title. And then
And just to quickly chime in, I didn't. I don't know if I mentioned this. The design layout and the boss design, and even I do hats off to all that. So go on. Sorry.
yeah, I mean, I think that there were a lot of ideas in this game, and I don't think they were really fully realized. I mean, this game really gave us like the first version of bullet time that I can think of, like which was really popularized by Max Payne, where you like slow down and you can leap in a direction and
Mhm.
you're like shooting and everything. Like that was in this game, and I really didn't notice that until having to play it. So like I think they did a lot of cool things with this title, and I'm really glad that the franchise took off because I think it is like kind of a big flagship thing. But as far as playing this for fun, like, I don't think it's worth it. Like, just go watch someone play it, and there's a lot of lava that people get dropped into, so it's entertaining in its own regard in that point.
If you can, watch it with commentary, because I didn't do this myself, but I'm sure there's plenty of commentary where people are just frustrated and going just screaming at their
watch
game,
somebody
Cory
speedrun
style.
it. Just watch someone speedrun it. Anyway,
I wanna
over to
watch
you,
you speedrun it.
Spoons.
All right, so I think the original Tomb Raider, great place in history and deserves the place in history it has. I think that its reasons for being there, yes, a lot of marketing. I think it was pretty unique for its time. It did things a different way, and it didn't necessarily always do them well, but it did innovate. And playing this game again, I wasn't particularly wanting to play the rest of them again. I wasn't particularly wanting to go play the originals again. I wasn't even particularly wanting to play Legends and Underworld again, even though those were significantly improved upon from the very first original 6, right? But what it did make me want to do is replay the most recent reboot again. It really made me want to start again with that 2013 Tomb Raider game and play through all 3 of those again, because it took those initial really cool, interesting ideas, and they've now made them into really good games, and games that are enjoyable to play as opposed to just frustrating, games that are well developed, games that have actually developed characters with personalities. Yes, it's a violent game, but it's a realistic type of violence. Yes, it has some supernatural, but the actual way that you interact with the world. I remember thinking when I was playing those games, like, oh, this would be horrible. Oh, I'd hate to be in this situation. Imagine all the bacteria. And just, I'd hate to be in this dirty river, all of the infections you'd get and things like that. But it gives you a sense of realism that you don't get from the original games, because they weren't as visually developed, and they weren't as developed in other ways as well. So I think that it really has led us to a point where we've got some fantastic games. And unfortunately, the very first few games, they did an interesting thing with them. They just didn't do it as well as they can these days. So I think that the series itself, the whole Tomb Raider franchise, well-deserved place in video game history and today. But yeah, in terms of playing games for an enjoyable experience, I wouldn't necessarily recommend replaying those original ones.
Very well said. With that out of the way, I want to congratulate our 2 winners. I didn't mention that at the beginning of the episode, but we have 2 more winners for our North American eShop giveaway codes of either Celeste or Golf Story, and that was Lum and Baeyonetta 2. So congratulations. I'm going to contact you on Twitter so that you can pick up your codes. Last but not least, Devin, I'd literally like to hear about where people can find you and what you may have on the horizon. You mentioned a book earlier, where they can find that once it's eventually published.
Yeah, so I have just written with a co-author, which is a co-worker of mine, a book on tabletop game design. It's called Meaningful Game Design, and you can find it on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and places like that. It's available in hardcover and paperback, and it's available for purchase now, but it's not actually out until November this year, so November 2023. And you can just find it by searching Meaningful Game Design, I think. But yes, that one's very much focused on tabletop game design, with the idea that basically good game design is good design regardless of the medium that you're in. So I teach tabletop game design to students because that means you can start designing games without having any programming experience or knowledge as well. But yeah, that's where you can find out a little bit more about something I do.
And you said the book is coming out November 2023?
Correct, yes.
So just in time for Christmas, and I've got a brother-in-law who loves tabletop games. So, what's the name of it again?
Meaningful Game Design. It is,
Right.
I will warn you, it's an academic textbook, and you know what academic textbooks can be like. They're not as cheap as your traditional paperback, I'm afraid. But it's a pretty chunky book, and
like I said, it'd be a good Christmas present.
Yeah, we were very fortunate to have a wonderful colleague of mine do all the visuals for it as well, because I'm not a graphic designer, but she is. So hopefully it will look nice on people's shelves as well.
Yeah, that's something I'm definitely going to pick up. So, Devin, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day. I know it's considerably later for you, whereas the rest of us, I'm getting ready to go have lunch, but you're probably getting ready for bed.
Oh, not quite bed. I am getting ready to go out though, because it is a Saturday evening. So
Oh,
I'm
yes.
going to
Well,
meet some friends.
Well, wonderful. But thank you so much for taking the time to go ahead and do this. I really, really appreciate it. And your thoughts were so insightful. I absolutely want to have you on again to talk to you about another game. And hopefully it'll be one that I have a lot more feelings for, that I can actually express a more joyous manner here. Chris, Cory, thank you as well. And everyone out there, thank you so much for listening. You can find us on Twitter, co-host, Spoutable. And as always, we're on iHeartRadio, and you can always join our Discord server. We'd love to hear you. Everyone out there, thank you. We'll see you next time. We've been Superannuated Starman.